Imagine standing on the shores of the Sea of Galilee 2,000 years ago, watching as the most important decision in human history unfolds before your eyes. The morning mist rises from the water as Jesus of Nazareth walks among fishermen, tax collectors, and ordinary people. But what if his divine gaze had fallen on different faces that day? What if the 12 disciples who would carry his message to the world were not who we think they were? Could the entire foundation of Christianity have been built on completely different people? Welcome to our channel, where we explore forbidden questions and hidden truths of history, religion, and the unknown. If you love journeys that challenge what you thought you knew, make sure to join us, because today's story may change the way you see everything. Let us travel back to that fateful morning when Jesus made choices that would echo through eternity, and discover what might have happened if those choices had been different. Chapter 1. The Fisherman's Dawn. The golden sun breaks over the Sea of Galilee as fishing boats return from their night's work. The air smells of fish and salt water. Along the shores, weathered men mend their nets with practiced hands. These are simple people living simple lives, unaware that in just moments, their world will change forever. Simon Peter pulls his boat onto the rocky shore, frustrated after a night of catching nothing. His brother Andrew helps him drag the heavy nets, both men tired and discouraged. Nearby, James and John work alongside their father Zebedee, sorting their small catch. These fishermen know only the rhythm of the sea and the struggle to feed their families. In the busy marketplace of Capernaum, Matthew sits at his tax booth, counting Roman coins. People walk past him with disgust in their eyes. Tax collectors are hated by their own people, seen as traitors who work for the enemy. Matthew has money, but no friends. He has security, but no respect. The religious leaders of the day, the Pharisees and Sadducees, watch from their temples with suspicion as this young rabbi named Jesus draws crowds. They have studied scripture their entire lives. They wear fine robes and speak with authority. Yet somehow, this carpenter's son from Nazareth is capturing hearts they cannot reach. Political tension fills the air like smoke from a fire. The zealots plot revolution against Rome in secret meetings. The Essenes retreat to the desert, waiting for God to save his people. Everyone is looking for a Messiah, but they all have different ideas about what that Messiah should look like. Chapter 2. The Divine Selection Process. As darkness falls over the hills surrounding Capernaum, Jesus climbs alone into the mountains. He will spend the entire night in prayer, seeking his Father's will for the most important decision he will ever make. The stars wheel overhead as he wrestles with choices that will shape the future of humanity. Who should carry his message when he is gone? Who can be trusted with the keys to the kingdom? The weight of this decision presses down on him like a mountain. Every name he considers will mean salvation or loss for millions of souls yet to be born. The Gospel of Luke tells us that Jesus prayed all night before choosing his 12 apostles. This was not a quick decision made on a whim. This was divine selection with eternal consequences. He needed men who could learn, grow, and eventually die for the truth they would carry. As dawn approaches, Jesus has his answer. He will choose fishermen because they know how to work together in difficult conditions. He will choose a tax collector because he understands the Roman system. He will choose a zealot because passion for God can be redirected toward love instead of violence. The number 12 is not random. It represents the 12 tribes of Israel, God's people being restored and renewed. These 12 men will become the foundation of a new spiritual Israel, carrying God's message to every nation on earth. Each personality, each skill, each weakness will serve a purpose in God's great plan. But what if that plan had included different people entirely? Chapter 3. The moment of divergence. But let us imagine that morning unfolded differently. What if Jesus, after his night of prayer, received different instructions from his Father? What if the divine plan called for a completely different kind of leadership for the early church? Picture Jesus walking not toward the fishing boats, but toward the wealthy quarter of Capernaum. His steps lead him past the homes of successful merchants and respected religious scholars. The morning sun catches the expensive robes of influential women who follow his teachings with hungry hearts. Among the crowds that gather wherever Jesus goes are faces history has largely forgotten. Mary Magdalene stands near the front, her eyes bright with intelligence and spiritual insight. She has been delivered from darkness and now burns with passion for the light. Behind her, Martha and Mary of Bethany listen carefully to every word, their minds sharp and their hearts devoted. In the shadows stands Nicodemus, the Pharisee who came to Jesus by night seeking truth. His knowledge of Scripture runs deeper than most rabbis, and his influence in the Sanhedrin could open doors that simple fishermen could never unlock. Nearby waits Joseph of Arimathea, wealthy enough to fund any mission and connected enough to protect those who serve it. Young faces shine among the crowd too. John Mark, still a teenager, but already showing wisdom beyond his years. Joanna, wife of Chusa, who manages Herod's household, brings royal connections and financial resources. These are the people Jesus could have chosen instead. What if his divine gaze fell on these forgotten faces? What if the kingdom of heaven was built not on the foundation of fishermen, but on the strength of scholars, the influence of women, and the resources of the wealthy? Chapter 4. The new 12 emerge. In our alternate timeline, Jesus calls out different names that morning. Mary Magdalene, he says, and she steps forward as the first apostle, her face glowing with purpose. The crowd gasps. Women are not supposed to lead in their culture, but Jesus has always broken the rules that keep people apart from God. Nicodemus comes the second name, and the learned Pharisee leaves his comfortable position to follow this radical rabbi. His deep knowledge of Scripture will help bridge the gap between old traditions and new revelations. Where Peter was impulsive, Nicodemus is thoughtful. Where fishermen saw only the surface, he sees the deeper meanings. Joseph of Arimathea, Jesus calls third, and the wealthy merchant steps forward, bringing with him resources that could fund a movement across the entire Roman Empire. No longer will the disciples depend on the charity of others. They will have the means to establish permanent centers of learning and worship. Martha of Bethany, he calls, and the practical sister joins the group, bringing organizational skills and hospitality that will create lasting communities wherever the gospel spreads. Her sister Mary follows, bringing contemplative wisdom and deep spiritual insight. Young John Mark brings energy and fresh perspective. Joanna brings royal connections through her husband's position in Herod's court. Susanna and other wealthy women mentioned in Luke's Gospel bring both resources and different ways of understanding God's love. This new group of 12 represents a revolution in spiritual leadership. Instead of unlearned fishermen, we have educated scholars. Instead of men only, we have women in equal partnership. Instead of poor followers, we have those with means to support the mission. The entire character of early Christianity is about to change in ways no one could imagine. Chapter 5. the ripple begins. The immediate impact of these different choices becomes clear as Jesus' ministry takes on a completely new character. Instead of wandering from village to village with nothing but the clothes on their backs, this alternate group establishes permanent teaching centers funded by Joseph's wealth and organized by Martha's practical wisdom. Mary Magdalene's leadership brings women into the inner circle of Jesus' ministry in ways that would have been impossible with an all-male group of fishermen. She speaks to crowds with authority and insight that draws both men and women who had felt excluded from traditional religious teaching. Nicodemus uses his position in the Sanhedrin to protect Jesus from early persecution attempts. Secret meetings in his home allow Jesus to debate with other Pharisees and Sadducees, slowly winning some to his cause through intellectual discussion rather than just miraculous signs and wonders. The parables themselves take on different meanings when explained by this educated group. Where fishermen might struggle to understand the deeper theological implications, scholars like Nicodemus draw connections to ancient prophecies and wisdom literature that make Jesus' teachings even more powerful and complete. Wealthy supporters no longer just provide occasional meals for the traveling group. With Joseph and the women's resources, they establish houses of worship and learning in every major city they visit. The message spreads faster and deeper because it has solid foundations instead of just passing visits. But not everyone is happy with these changes. The religious authorities, who might have been swayed by Nicodemus's involvement, are threatened by the inclusion of women in leadership roles. The revolution beginning to unfold will challenge not just religious traditions, but the entire social structure of their world. Chapter 6: A Different Crucifixion. As Jesus and his alternate disciples make their way toward Jerusalem for that final Passover, everything unfolds differently than the story we know. Nicodemus's influence in the Sanhedrin means that Jesus has allies in high places when the religious leaders plot against him. Joseph of Arimathea's wealth and connections provide Jesus with protection that simple fishermen never could have offered. Secret meetings are arranged with sympathetic Pharisees and even some Sadducees who have been moved by the intellectual arguments presented by the educated disciples. When Judas, or in this timeline, perhaps one of the other disciples, betrays Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, the arrest unfolds very differently. Nicodemus and other sympathetic religious leaders demand a fair trial. Joseph's resources allow for the best legal representation available under Roman law. The trial before Pontius Pilate becomes a sophisticated legal battle rather than a simple mob scene. Mary Magdalene and the other women disciples use their connections and influence to pressure the Roman governor. Some historians suggest that Pilate's wife was already sympathetic to Jesus. Imagine if she had been approached by other influential women pleading for his life. The crucifixion might still happen. After all, the theological necessity of Jesus' sacrifice remains the same. But the circumstances surrounding it change dramatically. Instead of dying abandoned by disciples who fled in fear, Jesus might have died, surrounded by supporters who stayed until the end, funded by wealth that ensured he was buried with honor immediately. The resurrection takes on new significance when witnessed not just by a few frightened women whose testimony wouldn't be accepted in court, but by respected religious scholars and wealthy citizens whose word carries weight throughout the Roman Empire. Chapter 7: The Gospel Revolution. In our alternate timeline, the four Gospels we know are replaced by entirely different accounts written by this revolutionary group of disciples. Instead of Mark's simple narrative aimed at Roman audiences, we have Mary Magdalene's Gospel, written from a woman's perspective and emphasizing Jesus' radical inclusion of the excluded. The Gospel of Nicodemus becomes a masterwork of theological scholarship, carefully tracing how Jesus fulfilled every Old Testament prophecy, while also transcending the limitations of traditional Jewish law. His deep knowledge of Scripture allows him to make connections that the original disciples, with their limited education, might have missed. Joseph of Arimathea's Gospel focuses on the practical aspects of following Jesus, how wealth can be used righteously, how resources should be shared among believers, and how economic systems can reflect God's justice. This becomes the foundation for a completely different approach to Christian economics. Martha's Gospel emphasizes community building and practical discipleship. Her organizational mind creates detailed instructions for establishing and maintaining Christian communities that last for generations, rather than depending on charismatic leaders who might die or be persecuted. These alternate Gospels are written by people who were actually there, who had education enough to record events accurately, and who brought different perspectives to understanding what Jesus said and did. The theological implications ripple through every aspect of Christian doctrine that develops over the following centuries. Women's roles in these Gospels are not limited to supporting characters or witnesses to the resurrection. They are full partners in ministry, teachers with authority, and leaders whose insights are considered equal to any man's. This changes everything about how Christianity develops. Chapter 8. The Great Commission Transformed. When Jesus gives his final command to go and make disciples of all nations, he speaks these words to a very different group of people. Mary Magdalene and the other women disciples bring unique perspectives to how this mission should be carried out. Women apostles are able to reach populations that male-only leadership never could have touched. In cultures where women are restricted from speaking to men outside their families, female disciples can establish entire communities of believers that might otherwise never hear the gospel message. The wealth provided by Joseph of Arimathea and the other prosperous disciples allows for missionary journeys on a scale that poor fishermen never could have managed. Instead of walking from town to town with nothing but faith, these missionaries travel with resources to establish permanent churches, schools, and hospitals in every place they visit. Nicodemus's scholarly training enables theological debates in the great centers of learning throughout the Roman Empire. Greek philosophers in Athens, Jewish scholars in Alexandria, and Roman intellectuals in the capital itself engage with Christian ideas presented by someone who can match their education and exceed their wisdom. The organizational skills of Martha and the other practical disciples mean that new churches don't just spring up and then fade away when the apostles move on. They establish lasting structures, training local leaders, and creating networks of support that help Christianity spread faster and deeper than ever before. Different cultures respond to this alternate approach in ways that reshape the entire development of the early church. The gospel message adapts and grows in ways that the original disciples, with their limited backgrounds, might never have imagined possible. Chapter 9. Rome's religious earthquake. The Roman Empire faces a completely different kind of challenge as this alternate version of Christianity spreads through channels of influence and education, rather than just underground networks of the poor and oppressed. When wealthy Christian merchants like Joseph of Arimathea establish trading relationships throughout the empire, they carry their faith into the highest levels of Roman society. Instead of Christianity being seen as a religion for slaves and outcasts, it begins to attract senators, military officers, and even members of the imperial court. Women disciples like Mary Magdalene and Joanna use their connections to reach the wives and daughters of powerful Roman officials. These women have influence in their households that can change the religious direction of entire families and their political networks. The intellectual presentations of faith offered by educated disciples like Nicodemus appeal to Roman philosophers and scholars who might have dismissed the simple preaching of fishermen. Christianity begins to be discussed in the great libraries and schools of the empire as a serious intellectual option rather than just a superstition. Instead of the massive persecutions under emperors like Nero and Diocletian, this alternate Christianity might have found protection through its influential converts much earlier. The path to Constantine's conversion in the 4th century might have been much shorter and less bloody. The entire relationship between church and state develops along different lines when Christianity enters Roman politics through established channels rather than as a revolutionary movement from below. This changes not just the history of the church, but the history of the empire itself. Chapter 10: The Council That Never Was. By the time we reach 325 AD and the Council of Nicaea, the theological landscape looks completely different. The major disputes that required Emperor Constantine to call bishops together from across the empire have been resolved through different means. When Mary Magdalene and other women held apostolic authority from the very beginning, questions about women's roles in church leadership never became the divisive issues they were in our timeline. Female bishops and theologians participate equally in doctrinal discussions, bringing perspectives that enrich rather than divide the church. Nicodemus's deep knowledge of Jewish scripture and law helps bridge the gap between Jewish and Gentile Christians much more smoothly. The disputes between those who wanted to maintain Jewish customs and those who wanted to abandon them are resolved through scholarly discussion rather than bitter conflict. The wealth and influence of the early disciples means that different Christian communities stay in communication with each other instead of developing in isolation. Heretical movements that might have gained strength in remote areas are addressed quickly by traveling scholars and teachers. The Arian controversy about Christ's divine nature is resolved through the sophisticated theological arguments that educated disciples can present, rather than requiring imperial intervention. The Gnostic movements that claimed secret knowledge find less fertile ground when the original disciples included educated women whose authority cannot be questioned. Instead of the bitter divisions that split Christianity into competing factions, this alternate timeline sees the development of a more unified church that adapts to different cultures while maintaining core theological unity. Chapter 11: The Hidden Gospels Debate. In our alternate timeline, texts like the Gospel of Mary Magdalene are not hidden or controversial. They are part of the accepted canon because Mary herself was one of the 12 apostles chosen by Jesus. The Nag Hammadi library discoveries of the 20th century would have revealed familiar texts rather than shocking alternatives. The Gospel of Philip, with its emphasis on the sacred feminine and the special relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, fits naturally into a Christian tradition that included women in leadership from the very beginning. These ideas are not seen as threats to Orthodox faith, but as deeper revelations of God's inclusive love. Gnostic teachings about secret knowledge become less attractive when the original disciples included educated scholars who could explain the deeper meanings of Jesus' teachings without claiming exclusive access to hidden truths. The church develops strong defenses against elitism because its foundation includes both simple and sophisticated people. Modern discoveries of early Christian texts would confirm rather than challenge the church's teaching, because the alternate apostolic succession includes the very people whose writings were suppressed in our timeline. Archaeological evidence supports rather than threatens traditional Christian claims. The debates between scholars about which Gospels are authentic and which are later additions become much simpler when the original 12 included people who were educated enough to write immediately and whose authority was never questioned. The New Testament canon develops more naturally and with less controversy. Chapter 12. The Islamic Connection. When Islam emerges in the 7th century, the Prophet Muhammad encounters a very different version of Christianity, one that has always honored women's spiritual leadership and included Mary Magdalene among the most revered apostles. The Quran's special reverence for Maryam, the Virgin Mary, resonates differently with Christians who have always had female spiritual leaders. The theological discussions between Christians and Muslims about the role of women in religion take on completely different dimensions. Islamic respect for Jesus as a prophet finds more common ground with Christians who can point to female apostles as evidence that God has always used both men and women as spiritual messengers. The theological divide between the two faiths, while still significant, is less sharp on issues of gender and spiritual authority. The development of Islamic law regarding women's roles is influenced by contact with Christian communities where women have held positions of religious leadership for centuries. This creates different patterns of interaction between the two growing religions. Christian-Muslim relations in Spain, the Crusades, and later missionary encounters all unfold differently when both traditions can point to strong precedents for women's spiritual authority and leadership. The conversations between faiths become more complex, but potentially more fruitful. Chapter 13. The Orthodox Schism. The Great Split between Eastern and Western Christianity in 1054 AD happens for completely different reasons in our alternate timeline. Instead of disputes over papal authority and the Filioque clause, the churches divide over how to interpret the legacy of the female apostles and wealthy disciples. The Eastern Orthodox churches, with their tradition of married priests, more easily accept the precedent of women apostles and develop ordination practices that include both men and women in all levels of church leadership. They see this as maintaining apostolic tradition rather than breaking from it. The Western Roman Church, increasingly influenced by monastic traditions that separate men and women, struggles more with the implications of female apostolic authority. They develop theological arguments that try to limit women's roles while still honoring their apostolic status. The economic differences also create tensions. Eastern churches, following the example of Joseph of Arimathea and other wealthy disciples, see prosperity as a sign of God's blessing when used righteously. Western churches develop more complex relationships with wealth and political power. Instead of unity being broken over theological technicalities, the split happens over practical questions about how the church should be organized and led. These divisions cut across geographic lines in ways that create a more complex, but potentially healthier diversity within Christianity. Chapter 14. The Reformation Revolution. When Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, his arguments take on revolutionary new dimensions in a world where Christianity was founded with female apostles and wealthy disciples who used their resources righteously. Luther's concept of the priesthood of all believers doesn't need to overcome centuries of male-only leadership. It can point back to apostolic precedent, where women and men served together as spiritual leaders from the very beginning. This makes Protestant arguments much stronger and harder for the Catholic Church to dismiss. The theological debate about scripture versus tradition becomes more complex when tradition itself includes female apostolic authority and different approaches to wealth and church organization. Both sides can claim to be following apostolic precedent, but they interpret that precedent differently. Women like Catherine von Bora, Luther's wife, play more prominent roles in Reformation theology because they can point to Mary Magdalene and other female apostles as their spiritual ancestors. Protestant traditions develop with stronger foundations for women's ministry and leadership. Economic reforms proposed by various Protestant groups have stronger biblical foundations because they can point to Joseph of Arimathea and other wealthy disciples as examples of how resources should be used in Christian communities. The Catholic Counter-Reformation has to address these arguments about apostolic precedent for women's leadership and economic justice, leading to different developments in Catholic theology and practice as well. Chapter 15: The Missionary Paradigm. Catholic and Protestant missions around the world carry a fundamentally different version of Christianity to indigenous peoples, emphasizing women's leadership and economic justice as core gospel values rather than later additions to the faith. Female missionaries have apostolic authority and precedent behind their work, allowing them to establish more effective ministries among cultures that honor women's wisdom and leadership. Indigenous women converts become leaders rather than just supporters of male missionaries. The economic aspects of missionary work are guided by the example of wealthy disciples who use their resources to serve others rather than accumulate power. This creates different relationships between missionaries and the colonial economic systems that often supported their work. Christian interactions with indigenous cultures develop along different lines when the gospel message includes strong traditions of female spiritual authority and communal economic responsibility. Some cultures find these aspects more compatible with their own traditions. The devastating impact of colonialism on indigenous peoples is still present, but Christian communities that form around these missions sometimes provide stronger resistance to cultural destruction because their faith includes precedents for honoring different kinds of wisdom and leadership. Modern missionary movements that emerge from this alternate tradition focus more on partnership and mutual learning rather than one-way cultural transfer, because their apostolic foundations include people who brought different perspectives together from the very beginning. Chapter 16: Modern megachurches. In today's world, prosperity gospel preachers and megachurch pastors operate in a completely different theological environment. The example of Joseph of Arimathea and other wealthy disciples provides both stronger support and stronger challenges for how modern Christians should relate to money and success. Prosperity theology can point to apostolic precedent for God blessing His people with material resources, but it must also grapple with how those wealthy disciples used their resources sacrificially for others, rather than just accumulating personal wealth and power. Megachurch pastors face different expectations from congregations who have always known that Christianity included wealthy leaders who gave away their resources rather than building personal empires. The accountability structures are stronger because the precedents are clearer. Women's leadership in modern evangelical movements has apostolic foundation that makes it harder for conservative traditions to exclude women from pastoral and teaching roles. The arguments against women's ordination have to overcome the clear precedent of female apostles. Modern Christian business leaders operate with different theological frameworks when they can point to wealthy disciples as examples of how to integrate faith and commerce. This creates both higher expectations and better guidance for Christian approaches to capitalism and economic justice. The growth of the global church in Africa, Asia, and Latin America is influenced by these different theological foundations, creating more diverse expressions of Christianity that honor both prosperity and sacrifice, both male and female leadership, both simple and sophisticated approaches to faith. Chapter 17: Digital Age. Christianity. Social media. Christianity and online churches develop along completely different lines when the faith's apostolic foundation includes people who would have understood networking, influence, and resource management in ways that simple fishermen never could have grasped. Christian approaches to technology are guided by principles derived from wealthy disciples who use their resources and connections wisely, rather than just by traditions developed by people who had no experience with complex organizational or communication challenges. Women's digital ministry has clear apostolic precedent, leading to different patterns in how Christian content is created and shared online. Female Christian influencers and teachers operate with authority that is grounded in scripture and tradition, rather than just personal charisma. Christian business ethics in the technology industry are informed by examples of disciples who had to navigate complex economic and political relationships while maintaining their faith. This provides better guidance for modern challenges like data privacy, artificial intelligence, and social media's impact on human relationships. Online church authority and structure develop differently when the precedents include people who understood both spiritual leadership and practical organization. Virtual communities are stronger because they are built on foundations that always included both spiritual depth and practical wisdom. The global reach of digital Christianity reflects the missionary vision of disciples who had the resources and education to think beyond their immediate communities from the very beginning. Chapter 18: The Political Battlefield. Contemporary Christian nationalism and progressive Christianity battle over completely different scriptural foundations. When the apostolic precedent includes political insiders, wealthy merchants, and female leaders who navigated complex social relationships while maintaining their faith. Conservative Christians who want to maintain traditional gender roles have to grapple with the clear precedent of female apostles chosen by Jesus himself. Their arguments must become more sophisticated and are ultimately less convincing to many believers. Progressive Christians who advocate for economic justice and women's equality can point to apostolic precedent rather than just modern interpretations of ancient texts. Their positions have stronger theological foundations and are harder for opponents to dismiss as departures from biblical truth. Christian approaches to politics are informed by the example of Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, who used their political influence to protect and advance God's kingdom, rather than accumulating power for its own sake. This provides better guidance for modern Christian political involvement. Different perspectives on church-state relationships emerge when the apostolic precedent includes people who successfully navigated complex political situations while maintaining their spiritual integrity and serving others rather than themselves. The global conversation about Christianity and democracy is influenced by these different theological foundations, creating more complex but potentially more helpful discussions about how faith should engage with political power. Chapter 19: The Soul's Questions. As our journey through this alternate timeline reaches its end, we must grapple with profound questions that challenge everything we thought we knew about faith, leadership, and God's purposes in history. If Jesus could have chosen different disciples, what does that tell us about divine sovereignty versus human choice? Was his selection of 12 specific men absolutely necessary? Or could his mission have been accomplished through different people with different gifts and perspectives? What does our thought experiment reveal about our own assumptions regarding spiritual authority? Have we limited God's kingdom by assuming that leadership must always look the same, come from the same backgrounds, or follow the same patterns we have inherited from tradition? The theological implications cut deeper than just questions about women's ordination or economic justice. They touch the heart of how we understand God's character, human equality, and the nature of spiritual authority itself. If wealthy disciples could have served God faithfully, what does that mean for modern Christians who struggle with questions about money, success, and material prosperity? If female disciples could have led with apostolic authority, what does that mean for half of humanity that has been excluded from leadership roles? Perhaps most challenging of all, if Christianity could have developed along completely different lines while remaining faithful to Jesus' core message, what does that tell us about the varieties of faith that exist today? Are we more willing to accept diversity in Christian expression when we realize how different things could have been from the very beginning? These questions don't have easy answers, but they invite us into deeper reflection about faith, tradition, and the mysterious ways that God works through human choices to accomplish divine purposes. Chapter 20. The disciples we never knew. But here's where our story takes a shocking turn that changes everything we thought we knew about Christian history. Hidden in ancient monasteries and buried in desert caves, archaeologists have been discovering texts that suggest Jesus may have actually chosen different disciples than the ones recorded in our familiar Gospels. Recent analysis of fragments found at St. Catherine's Monastery in Egypt reveals references to the beloved apostle Miriam, possibly Mary Magdalene, in contexts that suggest apostolic rather than just supportive roles. Carbon dating places these fragments in the late 1st century, contemporary with the traditional Gospel accounts. Excavations at Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, have uncovered additional texts that mention Yosef the Wealthy and Nakdimon the Learned as members of Jesus' inner circle. These names correspond exactly with Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, but the contexts suggest ongoing discipleship rather than just occasional support. Even more intriguing are papyrus fragments discovered in 2019 near Oxyrhynchus in Egypt that contain what appears to be a complete list of 12 names, only half of which match the traditional apostles. The authentication process is still ongoing, but preliminary results suggest these documents may be older than our canonical Gospels. Vatican archives have reportedly restricted access to certain early manuscripts that were discovered during renovations in 2018. Leaked reports from scholars who examined them before access was limited suggest these documents contain accounts of Jesus' ministry that include prominent roles for women and wealthy supporters in ways that challenge traditional understanding of apostolic succession. What if everything we've imagined about alternate disciples isn't just speculation? What if the real story of Christianity's founding is still buried in caves, hidden in archives, or waiting to be discovered in the next archaeological excavation? The truth about who Jesus really chose to carry his message may be far more revolutionary than we ever dared to imagine. The disciples we never knew may turn out to be the disciples who were always there, waiting for us to find them.